Our theme is Weltschmerz, and this is a concept which comes from German Romanticism, and poets like Mörike or composers like Bruckner. So the Romantic movement, which was not only opposed to classicism, but it was also opposed to all what we just heard, to the industrialization process, to the bourgeois enlightenment. So it wanted to rescue issues from the past, but it was particularly concerned with human suffering. So I think that the real source for Weltschmerz is the old problem of theodicy, and I would like to say a few things about this. The theodicy means the defense of God's justice in the face of the horror and terror in this world as nature and man. And we just have heard some of this catastrophe and disaster, which people are suffering from today and have suffered for quite some time. The theodicy was the beginning of all theology, particularly in the Greek world, in the ancient Greek world. And theology was, first of all, theodicy, the defense of the gods and of God against this disaster under which people have to suffer. Our deacon, Joe, in our student parish here at Western Michigan University, still does theodicy when he starts every sermon with God is good. And the community then answers, God is good. Recently, the deacon was terribly beaten up by people in the parking lot and had to be brought into the hospital. But a few weeks later, he started again his sermons with God is good, and did not ask where was God when he needed him, the theodicy question. Jesus himself asked in his discourse with a young rich man, why do you call me good? Only one is good, God in heaven. But during his execution, Jesus asked with Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is the theodicy question. The psalm ends more optimistically, but Jesus did not get to the end of the psalm. Crucifixion caused a fatal heart attack. That was not always so. There were dualistic Manichaean theologies separating the Hebrew Bible with its bad God from the New Testament with its good God, like Ahura Mazda and Ahriman in the Persian religion, or like Mithras fighting the bull in so many altars along the Rhine River, the Danube, and in southern England, where we see this image of Mithras. Later on, theodicy moved into the background. Theology became more positive and did not want to talk about the theodicy problem any longer. Theologians did not want to talk about it. After the catastrophic 20th century, we must talk about it nevertheless. And theologians like Metz and Küng and Moltmann discussed it with the Marxist philosopher Bloch, who always emphasized that the 10,000 slaves which were executed with Spartacus, that none of them was resurrected. In some religions, it may be blasphemy to raise the theodicy question. Certainly not in Judaism, as the religion of sublimity. There is Psalm 22, and there is the book Job. Also not in Christianity, the religion of becoming, freedom, and full manifestation, as Jesus' last words show. But maybe in Islam, the religion of law, the theodicy question may be taboo. In the 1980s, my friend Walter Dirks refused to publish a whole issue of his Frankfurter Heft journal, a left-wing Catholic journal, on the theodicy problem, when his co-editor, Eugen Kogon, the author of the SS State, wanted to do so. There was a conflict between the friends. There were tears even. Kogon had been in Buchenwald for 7 years. Dirks had been in internal emigration. He was hiding in Germany during the Nazi time after having been in prison because of his battle against fascism. Dirks believed that man had a right to happiness, also if he had not been in a concentration camp like Kogon. When I told my friend, the great Canadian theologian Gregory Baum, shortly before his death, that my son Steve had died from cancer, like his mother Margie and his grandfather Bruno before, and that thus we as a family faced once again the theodicy problem, he reminded me that in all my books, I always blamed nature or man for the suffering in the world, not God. That was true. Gregory also did not want to talk about the theodicy problem. He was too optimistic. But if God created the world and governed it, as the revelations say, the world, he was also responsible for it and what happened in it. There was no way around this. When I came to Frankfurt once from the civil war in Yugoslavia, I went to confession in the Capuchin church in Frankfurt. I started out with telling the father confessor, a Capuchin monk, about my war experiences, the 200,000 murdered people in a war instigated by Germany, the Vatican, and the CIA, through mobilizing the nationalisms against each other, which the self-management socialists had tried to reconcile. I asked the monk where his boss was in all of this. Where God was in the bloody war among the Slavs, the Serbs, the Croats, the Slovenians, the Montenegrins, the Bosnians. That was the theodicy problem at the time. The father confessor did not know the name theodicy, but he knew the problem and pointed to the fall of man and to the cross as solution. We must take the cross upon ourselves for redemption and reconciliation. One of the last great theodicies was written by Leibniz about the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil. He came up with and asserted that the present world was the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire, the great bourgeois enlightener, laughed Leibniz out of the court with his Candide. It is still played on the stage today. Once asked by priests in Kalamazoo to attack it, I was not able to. Voltaire was right. In modernity, the bourgeois, Marxian, and Freudian enlightenments emphasized the theodicy more than the believers and against the believers. There was, however, the critical theorist Theodor Adorno, non credo, I do not believe, against the incomplete manifestation and revelation in Christianity. He waited for a more complete revelation with less contradictions. But even Adorno had to admit that the Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew Passion Play could not be entirely untrue. Voltaire and his co-enlightener Rousseau invented the bourgeois deism as an attempt to solve the theodicy problem. God had simply left the world after he had created it, mainly to the bourgeoisie to do with it whatever it wanted to, colonialism, imperialism, world wars, without any concern for the Mosaic Decalogue or the Jesuanic Sermon on the Mount or the Golden Rule, which is valid in all world religions. At this moment in world history, January 2022, the Biden administration violates the golden rule when it claims the Monroe Doctrine only for itself, but does not grant something similar to the Russian Federation concerning the Ukraine, which has been taken over by fascist oligarchs. Hegel enjoyed the laughter of Voltaire about Leibniz' all too optimistic theodicy, but he also discovered the dialectic of enlightenment and the decay of the bourgeois enlightenment into positivism. It is as it is. The glass is still half full. Positivism discovers the facts, but forgets to ask the question if they are good or bad, and if they maybe should be changed. Hegel also renewed Leibniz's theodicy with the help of his notion and reality dialectic. Hegel saw the slaughter bench of world history, the Golgotha, as brutally as his archenemy Schopenhauer, who cursed his optimism. After Hegel had faced the historical slaughter bench in his philosophy of history, he suggested a shift of consciousness from the a posteriori position to the a priori position, position which science forbids us to take, to the reason of Parmenides, or the providence of the psalmists and the prophets, the reason and the providence which governed the world and negated its negativity and functionalized it through the cunning of reason with internal necessity toward the ultimate realm of freedom. That was consoling. That was indeed the theological optimism which Schopenhauer had cursed. Marx kept the idea of internal necessity, in spite of the fact that it was metaphysical and idealistic, but for him also with inner necessity, the historical movement moves toward the realm of freedom. Hegel's optimistic panentheistic philosophical theodicy was still, like that of Leibniz, rooted in the Abrahamic religions. Judaism had two solutions for the theodicy problem. One was punishment for the sins, the fall, or the personal sins. The other was a test of faith. Both solutions were very much shared by Judaism with Christianity and Islam. The starting point of both solutions was the myth of the fall. It was present not only in all three Abrahamic religions, but in other world religions as well, and also in great philosophy, like that of Hegel and Schopenhauer, and in art, like the tragedies of Sophocles and Aeschylus. According to Hegel, the fall, the knowledge of good and evil, separated man from the animals. Without it, there would be no human history. Man became like God. The serpent had been right. But man had also to overcome this antithesis of the fall through suffering, redemption, and reconciliation. According to the book Job, all suffering was a test for the faith and trust of the believers. God declared the critical Job to be right. The Hegelian left rejected Hegel's theodicy and thus his whole system up to the present because of its theological optimism, which outraged particularly the proletariat in civil society, which suffered most in liberal civil society, being robbed of its collective surplus value by the plutocratic ruling class, the billionaires, the oligarchs. Karl Marx secularized the theodicy into his historical materialism as a science of human suffering, which declared it to be caused by the private appropriation of collective surplus labor and to be resolved by the revolution of the global proletariat. Since for Marx history was closed, the dead were dead. Most of the workers who had worked and fought for the realm of freedom on the basis of natural and economic necessity would never reach and enjoy it. Of course, Marx may have been a pantheist in the tradition of Baruch Spinoza, like so many other progressive Jews. In this case, history would remain open, and the martyrized workers, even Spartacus, and the 10,000 slaves who were crucified with him on the Via Appia Antiqua could still have their day in court and be justified and redeemed and reconciled. Sigmund Freud secularized the theodicy into his psychoanalysis as a science of human suffering, which it declared to be caused by patricide and to be resolved through psychotherapy. Freud was in agreement and sympathy with and willing to accept the Marxist-Leninist experiment in Russia, the socialist revolution in St. Petersburg, but he also had serious doubts because of his biological determinism, the death drive. Even if the collective appropriation of the collective surplus labor would succeed, men would still find other reasons to kill and murder each other. According to Max Horkheimer, the founder of the critical theory and of the Frankfurt School, a Schopenhauerian like Sigmund Freud, like Thomas Mann, and like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, world history would not be understood, could not be understood, and explained without the fall. For Schopenhauer and Horkheimer, the great sin consisted in that one man sacrificed the happiness of the other man for his own. Redemption consisted in that the man was willing to sacrifice himself out of love for the well-being of the other. That was almost Christian. The Jesuit and anthropologist Teilhard de Chardin, who discovered the Peking man, wanted to give the fall a more progressive role in man's evolution toward the logosphere. But some of his Jesuit brothers wanted to prove his all too optimistic theory wrong by pointing to his most painful death through a heart attack in New York shortly before he wanted to travel to Africa for new anthropological discoveries, death as consequence of the fall. That happened in spite of the fact that the greatest enlightener, Immanuel Kant, had already made clear that man would have died also without the fall, simply because of his limited physiological structure. Teilhard de Chardin's books were printed and published in Moscow rather than in Rome because of their progressive Hegelian as well as Darwinian and Marxian orientation. For the great Marxist playwright Bertolt Brecht, man died like the animals. That put an end to the theodicy problem. But at the end of his life, Brecht lived in an apartment above Hegel's grave in the Dorothean Cemetery in East Berlin and read not only the Bible, but also the Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, and wanted to and was buried with his wife near Hegel and his wife Marie von Tucher, as well as near Fichte and his wife. The historical materialist Brecht had not forgotten the historical idealism, which he obviously negated not only abstractly, but rather determinedly and concretely. The Jewish playwright Wiesel described in his play The Night the trial of God, which Jewish prisoners arranged with prosecution and defense in the concentration camp Auschwitz. Before they were gassed with Cyclone B, invented by Fritz Haber, the Jewish father of gas war, and produced by I.G. Farben. The prisoners charged Yahweh with having broken the covenant to protect the chosen people and with having made a covenant with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. The prisoners found God to be guilty. But then they put their hands on their heads and walked into the gas chambers. Later on, there were Jews who never prayed again, but the others continued to pray. Today, in 2022, the critical theory of religion and society asks if one can really look at Auschwitz and Treblinka and the other death camps, and at the, according to Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, 6 million Jews, and also at the 26 million so-called communist Russians who were murdered in the Project Barbarossa by 1 million Catholic and Protestant Germans and Europeans, and say that all of them were punished for their sins? Obviously not. Certainly no rabbi would do so, not even the most conservative one. The name Shoah, catastrophe, is better than Holocaust, which comes from Wisel, burnt offering or sacrifice. Who would be the priest of such burnt sacrifice? And what would be the guilt? And what would be the purpose? The state of Israel? Today, the dialectical religiology also asks if one can really look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the 10,000 of civilians being incinerated by 2 atomic bombs, which had been developed by 2 Jews, Einstein and Oppenheimer, and ordered by President Truman and blessed with holy water by a Catholic priest, army chaplain of Polish origin, before they were exploded, one in flat territory and one in a mountainous area, in order to be able to study scientifically the different effects in different environments. Today, no still living world religion has a valid theoretical theodicy solution. That means a crisis for all of them, since to defend the gods or God in the face of the horror and terror of their world was their very purpose. There may still be a practical theodicy solution, for instance, the imitation of Buddha or of Moses or of Jesus or of Mohammed, which could give meaning to the Weltschmerz and consolation. Thank you. Well, we have developed, in the last 50 years, our critical theory of religion and society. And 2 things we did, like the Frankfurt School, we combined Marx and Freud. So what about that? To have the psychoanalytical side, but to connect it with Marx's social analysis. Marx didn't have a psychology and Freud didn't have a real sociology. So to combine the 2, as Marcuse did and Adorno did and Reich did and so on. So maybe that would be a way. As far as religion is concerned, both of them, I think Freud and Marx, have negated religion abstractly rather than concretely. That means to ask if some elements in religion, they certainly have to be negated. But if there are other elements which maybe could be translated, and it has been done already. So the neighborly love has been translated into solidarity. And are there more of these values, which, like the golden rule, into the Kantian imperative and so on, have been translated already? So may that be a way that one combines Freud and Marx and all their followers, and then at the same time, religion criticizes the world criticizes religion. So could we then maybe concretely negate or concretely determine religion by sure that superstitions and all that, with the Enlightenment movements, that we reject this, but that at the same time we are open for progressive values which are there in religions, which could correct all these illnesses which we have described today. So that I would like to make this addition to it. Yeah. So to leave the world like a monk or so, and sleep in one's coffin or so, these are extreme developments at the borderline of psycho problems and religion. So, but as a dialectical solution to the whole thing is to correct Lenin or correct Marx and so on. And there are beginnings in them. For instance, Marx may have been a pantheist and not an atheist. So, and he has positive things to say about religion, more than Freud. So, but could one apply methodologically determinate negation rather than abstract negation of religion. Then one would satisfy the longings of the enlighteners, which are correct and true, but one could also be positive about some sides of religion as well, which we do need in order to keep our mental health true.
Can I ask a question? So you're suggesting that we address this at the level of individuals or at the level of institution?
Well, Freud would be individual and Marx would be institutional and collective and so on. So to combine the antithesis of individual and collective, and combine also the antithesis between religion and secularity and enlightenment.
Okay.
Yeah, and
we have
something what Dr. Muradi was talking about in terms of transference of giving the analysts and different type of experience that they never had, for instance. We can tie that right back to Freud at the very beginning of psychoanalysis with the Wolfman. I don't know if you've ever seen this book, but this is about Wolfman 60 years later, after his time with Freud, where he basically says Freud was the most useless thing and the best thing. Why? He said, because his analysis did nothing for me, but him being there for me, listening to me, almost like an ersatz father, being a real intersubjectivity. That's what helped the man. And I think, in this modern day with the modern technology, that's one of the key things we're missing, is that true intersubjectivity.
Yeah, let me maybe add to it. There is this antagonism, of course, between the religious and the secular, and it's not from today. It is 500 years old at least, and it goes deeper and deeper, and it continues to go deeper and deeper. But there are, on the secular side, there are people who want religion to disappear because of all its negativity and so on. And but there are also modern enlightened people who are still somewhat open to the religious side. We have fundamentalists in all religions who say no to modernity and to enlightenment and so on. But we also have religious people who are open for the advances of modernity and willing to listen to it. So that we came up with this type of a solution. Not only that there was once a time when reason and faith were one, but also that as we go through this antagonism, there could be a possible reconciliation, maybe under new psychological and new sociological conditions.